So in this segment, we're going to be talking about an article written by Vicky Spratt, which is a really good article, which talks about the fact that thousands of people in the UK are living in dangerous, mold-ridden houses from private landlords, which are absolutely unsafe for habitation, and the fact that these landlords get away with it because the councils refuse to do anything about it. The council cite a lack of funding in the pandemic, but there's just a ridiculous situation right here. So this is quoting from the article. The smell caused by the mould and damp was so bad that my clothes stank. 50-year-old Eddie recalls Eddie and her 20-year-old son lived in an unsafe rented 2-bedroom flat in Brighton for 7 years. She is partially sighted, cannot work, and relies on universal credit to help pay her rent. All of my son's things got ruined. And I don't want to see anyone in the comments saying, oh, why don't you just move out? Because they explain it within the article. So just listen, get to the end of the video. But, it's simply the case that these landlords should not be able to get away with living conditions like this. Eddie is just one of the thousands of private renters who have been forced to live in unsafe, substandard homes because councils are not taking action against landlords, according to a Freedom of Information data obtained by campaigning group Generation Rent, because that's what my generation are, Generation Rent, where you're going to be able to afford housing. The data shared exclusively with the eye suggests 3/4 of private renters living with poor conditions are not being properly protected by the existing legislation because of a poor lack of enforcement. Because the thing is, you can have strong legislation, but if there's nothing to enforce it, then it doesn't work because there's nothing to make sure that legislation is in play. So the condition in Eddie's home deteriorated, that's the one, deteriorated with each year. Poor insulation caused the damp and mold to keep growing. It ruined her clothes and furniture. She developed a rash all over her body, which her GP told her likely caused by her living conditions. So this is more evidence that the council should have taken action, because she could take this note to her council and say, look, this is the situation right now in my house, you have to do something. She complained repeatedly to her landlord, who told her she was lucky to be renting from him because she was on benefits. And a lot of private landlords don't want to rent to people on benefits because the money goes directly to the universal credit claimant and not to the landlord. So sometimes landlords don't get paid, so that's why there's a reluctance to rent to people on housing benefit. But at the same time, that's a thing that needs to change dramatically. Also, universal credit needs to stay high. But the point being is that landlords take advantage of this because they know these people don't have many options, the ones that are on housing benefit. Eddie says he also accused her of using her disability to her advantage, making her feel panicked and harassed, like, this guy's a scumbag. I knew I might have trouble finding somewhere else because landlords do discriminate against people like me, so I was scared to leave. So this person, Eddie's in a complete situation where she can't get out because the council refused to do anything about it, or refused at the time to do anything about it, and she wasn't in a situation financially where she could move out because she does have disabilities and she is on housing benefit. It says here, as any Homes Under the Hammer aficionado knows, a fresh lick of paint covers a multitude of sins, but once Eddie had moved in, the scale of the problem started to become apparent. Furniture was damp and mouldering. One wooden chest of drawers was wrecked, she explains. I would wipe them down 3 or 4 times, take the drawers out to air them, but I couldn't make it much better because this stuff is it's toxic, it's rotten, you can't clean it. So try as this person would, you can't stop it, and it's just a sad situation. The landlords say I was causing the problem, but I kept pushing back and saying it had to be structural. The ventilation was very poor. So these landlords don't care because they know there's a housing shortage. They'll find someone else to rent the place out. She realised how serious were when the window in her son's bedroom fell out of its frame because it had rotted from the condensation. Again, this is more evidence that the council should have used, to do something about the situation. That's how bad things are right now. The good thing about that was it was replaced with double glazing. So, this person's window fell out, and the only benefit was that the window that was replaced was better. That's it. It says here, Eddie says her landlord also implied that he could evict her at any time and hassled her to leave. This is a problem as well. There should be this rule against evictions where the tenant hasn't done anything wrong. They have to get rid of that. Under Section 21 of the 1998 Housing Act, a landlord can evict a tenant with 2 months' notice without needing a reason. That needs to go, because that puts all the power in the hands of the landlord, where they can evict you within 2 months, but you can't end a tenancy agreement early. You can be held liable for that. In early 2020, Eddie went to her local council to make a formal complaint. Local authorities in England are responsible for enforcing safety standards in privately rented homes under the housing health and safety rating systems. A severe Category 1 hazard covers threats to health associated with increased prevalence of house dust mites and mold or fungal growths resulting from dampness and or high humidities. We know that's the case with this house because it's full of mold. It's not fit for human habitation. These are deemed serious offences because living with the presence of damp, staining and or mold growth poses a risk to the tenant's mental health, physical health and social well-being. So we know that this house here is a Category 1. It's a Category 1. When a private renter like Eddie gets to nowhere with a landlord, they can report the poor conditions to the authorities, the local authorities. If a Cat 1 hazard is found, the local council can serve the landlord with an improvement notice which compels them to make repairs. So they have to do it. This prevents the landlord from serving the tenant with a retaliatory no-month eviction for 6 months. So then the landlord can't take retaliatory action, say, look, alright, fine, we're going to repair the place, but you're out in 2 months. If the landlord fails to act on the improvement notice, the council can fine or prosecute them and the tenant can apply for a rent repayment order. So I think they'll get some of the rent payment back. Generation Rent made the FOIA information request to 110 councils, representing 2/3 of private renters in England, regarding their enforcement activities. Of the councils responded, so this is where it gets really bad. 76 recorded 11,570 Cat 1 hazards in private rented homes, but these councils only served 2,814, representing 24%. So not even a quarter of these Cat 1 hazards are actually done anything. The councils don't do anything about 75% of these cases, which is ridiculous because that's their job. That is their job, to deal with this stuff. And if the enforcement mechanism fails, then the law is pointless because no one's there to enforce it. It's like having laws against murder but not having any police officers or any courts or anything like that. It's not going to be enforced. This means that thousands of renters are left without protections they're entitled to. You're talking, thousands of people whose landlords have put them in a position where their place is not habitable to live in, and the council are not doing anything about it. Eddie was one of them. Brighton Council didn't follow up on her complaint, despite the fact that they're meant to. When the first lockdown happened, they were told they can't do much because of the pandemic, when realistically, if that's the case, then the law should have been changed at the time. What a ridiculous law. In the same email correspondence, the housing officer concedes that she was likely to be evicted because it makes more sense for the remedial work required to make her home more habitable to be taken once the flat becomes vacant. The thing is, they should have offered her a 2-bedroom flat somewhere else then, because they should have offered her something, because you can't live like this. And they should also repo the house. Anyone who lets the house fall into disrepair like this should have their house repossessed by the council at a knockoff price. Council redoes the house and then rents it or sells it. That's what should happen here. In the same email correspondence, the housing officer concedes that she was likely to be evicted because it makes more sense that we mentioned that. Eventually, her landlord did pursue eviction in late 2020. With the help of Brighton Council's homelessness prevention team, she was able to move, downsizing to a 1-bedroom flat, which costs more than the 2-bed flat, £950, because that's all she could afford. She could only afford a 1-bed flat in Brighton because there is a massive lack of social housing, which is just abysmal that the government haven't done more to build more affordable social housing for people. Because that's where you get some of these problems. This is a side effect of this, because if it was possible for her to move out somewhere else, she would have done it, but there wasn't anywhere. Her son has a bedroom and she sleeps in the living room, which again is not ideal for anyone to be living in the living room, to sleep in a living room. This is more expensive. The other place was at £800, so she pays under £150 a month. It took her ages to find a landlord who's willing to accept housing benefit, and if she'd been able to find somewhere else, she would have moved sooner. So that's a problem with housing benefit as well. There had been no improvement on enforcement since 2018-19, when the figure was at 24.6%. In 2017-18, it was at 20%. So the councils can't argue it's down to the pandemic, because we know the enforcement rates are very low. Private renters caught between a rock and a hard place, relying on landlords who can evict them when they complain, and local authorities without sufficient time or resources to enforce their right. Maybe this is something the councils have to focus more on to do this stuff, because the law has to change it, where you can have these houses repoed. The houses will get repaired and the landlord will get reimbursed below market rate and the cost of repairs. That's how things should be like this, because you should not let your property get in this disrepair if you're a landlord. Indeed, Eddie didn't at first. In a poll of just 1,008 private renters conducted by Surveyation on behalf of Generation Rent, just 35% of respondents knew to contact their local council if their home was unfit to live in. if their landlord was irresponsive. So only a few people, 35% of people, actually knew that you can contact the council if your place is not fit to live in. Ahead of May's local elections, it's clear that more needs to be done by local and central governments to shore up the rights of private renters and to do more to raise awareness about them. They had the Renters Reform Bill, but since its announcement in the 2019 Queen's Speech has been kicked into the long grass, this landmark piece of legislation would not only end Section 21 evictions, that's the sort of no-fault evictions, pledged by the government, but could introduce a national landlord database and lifetime deposits for renters where they could port from one rented property to another, which is quite interesting. Until then, the government is leaving private renters vulnerable. Why aren't Labour talking about this? This is something Labour could talk about, where they talk about the private rented industry. Come on, Starmer, honestly. In February this year, the Housing Minister, Christopher Pinchell, told the House of Commons that the bill, along with the ban on Section 21 evictions, would be introduced at the appropriate time when there is a sensible and stable economic blah 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 blah. This won't happen for a long time because they'll keep arguing this. The right time to do something is always now. It's always now. The right time to fix these issues is now. So hurry up, because you are taking the mick. This has been announced in 2019. So hurry up and do something. We face unprecedented economic blah blah blah. Alicia Kennedy, the director of Generation 10 Rent, told the Eye, inaction by council serves only to discourage renters from reporting safety problems, because you've got to imagine, if you report a problem and the council do nothing about it, then the landlord knows they can keep the state in disrepair, and also the fact that if you keep complaining, they can evict you, because why are you causing a problem for? I'm just going to get rid of you and get someone else in, because there's a massive lack of housing in this country, especially social housing. And to embolden landlords who cut corners with no council support, tenants move out, and because there are so many people desperate for a home, the landlord has no difficulty finding a new victim, which is absolutely the case, because there's a lack of housing. So this system has to change. A government spokesperson said, "We expect councils to enforce standards in a privately rented home, and they have a legal duty to act if they discover serious hazard." The thing is, by not inspecting the place, they haven't actually discovered a serious hazard, therefore they get away with it. The council can get away with it. So clearly the government has to fund more for these councils if they want anything to be done about it. But truth is, the council don't want to do anything about the government don't want to do anything about it, so that's why they haven't. They've had 11 years to solve this problem. They haven't. It says here, I think this spokesperson for Brighton Council said, unfortunately delays occurred due to restrictions during the pandemic. That's nonsense, because we know that enforcement rates, even pre-pandemic, was at 24% and I think about 19% respectively. So this person's lying. Our housing needs officers were also working with the tenant to find suitable alternative accommodation, which they did. They did help, thankfully. But it wasn't really enough, because it's a one-bed flat when they really need a two-bed flat. The names have been changed in this article, which it makes sense to do. So this is brilliant reporting from Vicky Spratt. Phenomenal stuff here. Massive credit to her. And we also know that when we actually look at one of the other problems, which is that council leaders are calling on the government to go further and use an expense spending round to reform the right to buy scheme, which is restricting councils from replacing homes sold. So under right to buy, if you live within a council house within a certain amount of time, you can buy the property. But the thing is, the councils can't replace the houses purchased under right to buy. So that creates another problem within social housing. Councils have seen an increase of nearly 350% in right-to-buy sales from 2,638 in 11-12 to 11,000 in 2017-18. This has amounted to nearly 70,000 council homes sold under right-to-buy in 7 years, with councils only building 11,300 in that time, which equals a loss of 58,000 socially rented homes over that period. And what that does is creates a gap for privately rented landlords to make a buck off this, because they can charge more money because there's a lack of social housing, and the fact they can keep the house in squalid conditions, because living in a moldy house is obviously better than being homeless. So that's the situation right now, and unless there are massive reforms that are done, I don't know what changes. So massive credit again to Vicky Spratt for bringing notice to this. Again, you don't see much of this covered on the BBC and other places. Print media does a far better job than TV outlets most of the time. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.